I'm really pleased to be here. Tias and I have been friends for a very long time. He's one of my best friends. I really enjoy spending a lot of time with Tias. I've had a chance to look over this book that it came in the mail the other day, and I'm really excited that he's published this book. It's got some really great articles, but some of the best things about the book are the exercises in the book. He's got a book. He's got exercises for meditation. He's got exercises for on the mat, and best of all, he's got exercises for off the mat, which is really important. In other words, you carry the practices that you do on the mat into your life and apply them to what you do during your day. So I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I haven't had a chance to look at it very closely because it just came a few days ago. But I think this is going to be a really great book, and I'm really excited that he published it. So I'm going to talk a little bit. Won't talk much more about Tias. He's a very interesting person, and it's a little bit second best to have the book, but rather than being with him directly. But I think the book is going to be a really good, well received by a lot of different people. So here is Tias Little, my good friend.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Richard. And it's really such a joy to join here together for me to be able to share a little bit with you my arduous task through producing another book, although it's a lot more lightweight than my first one. The Subtle Body book is a dense beast for sure. And this one is meant to have a lot more air in it. And a much more easy read. So I thought tonight that what I do is share a couple of segments from the book. I'll read a bit from it. I am slated to read it as an audiobook. I'm recording that here in a few weeks. So, but read. We must be a culture of readers for sure. Important this day in addition to yoga practice. So as many of you may know, we're based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So we're broadcasting live from 7,000 feet. I always feel sorry for you sea level dwellers. So we can get nice air up at this elevation. And so my book, The Practice is the Path, is all about being on the path. Many of you, I imagine, coming here this evening are on the path in some way. And I certainly have been. I started on the path in really the early 80s when I lived in Amherst, Massachusetts. And I'm very much influenced by the culture that I come out of. I talk about that in the book, my New England heritage. I grew up the son of an academic professor. So I'm just a professor's brat, really. And my father taught comparative religion. He actually taught a lot of the myths of Shiva, the Indian mythology, as well as, Kant and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And so really, I have a sort of predisposition towards, what we call Jnana Yoga, more of the intellectual side of yoga. I did my master's in Eastern philosophy here in Santa Fe. That was at St. John's College. It's easy for me to really just fall asleep at night, parsing Gita verses, and yet at the same time, I'm very much into the body. I was an athlete. I was a competitive athlete, actually. Played all 4 years of college soccer, and was elected All-American. Believe it or not, I was a pretty artistic midfielder. Never had much of a shot, but I just had a sense of space, like where my players, my teammates were around me. So I kind of bring that spatial awareness on the mat. And I've also had to work a lot with my striver, my competitive side, growing up in New England and surviving a small academic community requires a little bit of oomph. So, but also I'm very much influenced by my mother, who is a counselor. And so I really identify with so much of the heart. My father, I've really gleaned a lot from working with the mind. My mother, very much influenced from the heart. And so anyhow, the book is really an amalgam of my various wanderings on the path. And And so the introduction is where I wanted to start in, actually, because I talk a little bit about being on the path. And actually, just the opening goes like this. Not everyone in life finds a path that is meaningful and helps cure the spirit. Many never make it to the trailhead. More often, people end up moving through life in pursuit of the next best thing. Many, by default, end up on roads that lead them to strive for gain, making money, achieving popularity, and being successful. These roads have fast lanes, enabling people to move at greater speeds and achieve their goals in less time. Some end up in cul-de-sacs, confined by lives focused on pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. A path is different. On a path, you're meant to meander, to enjoy each footfall. Every ascent and every descent is part of the journey. And there may be moments, days, weeks, and months when you feel totally lost. The path is winding and circuitous, and the experience of losing your way is part of the way. A path is wide enough only for footsteps. You cannot drive an RV equipped with a kitchen and a flat screen TV down it. By necessity, you must travel light. Sometimes you find yourself on the path by happenstance. Someone on a whim takes you there, or you look for it on the World Wide Web. It doesn't matter how you get there. What matters is that sure-footed, with shoulders back and heart lifted, you trust the paths of your feet. So I started in on this path in studying Iyengar yoga. Actually, it was a rehab clinic for my wonky ankles and my knees that were blown out from doing competitive soccer, and yet at the same time I was very much into movement. I was in a modern dance company. It was based in Tucson, Arizona. I was always the peon in the back, just trying to sort of follow the people in front of me, but I've always had an artistic sensibility, and I'm very much interested now in the marriage, the merging of the arts and internal arts and poetry and practice, how the body and metaphor come together. So I use a lot of metaphors through the book, and obviously the path is the metaphor for the practice. So it goes on. This book is about being on the path, the path. It is about an essential journey that begins the moment you hear the reverberation of an inner voice that says simply, I must. It's about listening to the voice of yearning inside. Despite the odds and despite the many competing voices calling you back to familiar commutes and paved surfaces. For many of us, there is one year in our lifetime that sets the stage for all other years, one year that shapes our destiny. For me, it was when I was 7 and a voice prompted me to delve into the caverns of my soul. Not quite sure how that happened. I was maybe in the upstairs bedroom and I was looking out the window in the evening with the crickets, and there was the train. There was always a train that went, this was in the Berkshire Mountains in Massachusetts, and the train would go across the valley. And there was something about the light in the late summer, kind of like it is here now in August, the setting light that was spurred something in me, hard to put into words, that a strange yearning took over my young and impressionable mind, a longing to explore the labyrinth of my inner self. It sent me on a journey through many landscapes, teachers, instructions, and techniques. This voice, this spirit whisperer, coaxed me on, at times gentle and merciful, at other times fierce and uncompromising. The trek has demanded every fiber of being, and along the way, I have had to question the realities I assumed to be true. Through my teens and 20s, my internal navigation device worked erratically. I spent years traipsing off course, isolated in remote canyons, strayed from essential connections to myself and others. But despite years of disorientation and confusion and inner longing, a hidden hunger prompted me to persevere. So probably like you, perhaps, I've spent many many moons just sort of spinning around, just round and round, not really knowing which way to go. Really wasn't sure whether I should become a businessman or whether I should get a master's right away, or I should, strive for a PhD. So then it was like, well, wait a minute, how can I come back inside? How can I return? And so in this process, in the book, I map out really what I like to think of as the first half of the journey, which is the early years of practice, which I'll share with you. And then the latter half, they're very different from me. The first really 15 years of practice versus the latter 15 or 20, it has a very different feel. And so I say in the first half of the journey, we adhere to order, security, rote discipline. We are inclined to live by the letter of the law rather than by its spirit. We may impose strict boundaries on ourselves and be quick to judge others. Idealistic and moralistic, we may approach spirituality from the side of our small-minded self. Eager to be liked, obtain approval, and succeed. Out of a desire to gain a solid foothold within ourselves, we get attached to our systems, our techniques, our memorized verses, our badges, and our brands. In the beginning, we need affirmation that we are making progress. Success and security are paramount. We may over-identify with a style of practice, a sequence of poses, or a system of teachings. In the first half of my journey, I held strongly to the code of Ashtanga yoga, vegetarianism, and mantra. Initially, these foundational practices provided important footholds that enabled me to climb. In the arduous migration of the soul, however, we all come to a crossroads where we must relinquish all title, rank, and name. This demands another kind of exodus, one that involves risk and surrender. So really, I had such strong identifications in my early years with my practice. I identified myself as a certain yogi, a male yogi, and I could do certain poses, handstands. It was all very, boosting for my own sense of pride and my own sense of self-esteem, my own self-worth. And of course, we have studios with mirrors, and people are comparing, their pose from another person's pose. And there's all this kind of, well, how far am I? How flexible am I? And so there's all this sort of assessment, self-assessment going on. For me, it was quite strong. It was very, very much of a draw, a lure that brought me on. And then several formative experiences prompted me to gain a more panoramic view of myself and insight into the heart of the yoga teachings. The first involved my forays into Zen and the middle way path of the Buddha. When I first encountered the Heart Sutra and the cryptic yet compelling instruction, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, my very foundation rocked off its center. The second was by plummeting into the murky world of dreams. Through dream work, I caught glimpses of the longing, fear, and urges that reside in the umbra of my psyche. It is oftentimes a split, some traumatic moment, loss or rupture, that prompts us to break through the boundaries of our early self. This can be threatening, painful, even shocking, because we become so invested in the initial formulas that provide us with ground and stability. Why on earth would it need to change? Yet, in order to evolve, we must leave behind the strict order of the first half of practice and enter a new phase, one in which we realize the fragility and insubstantiality of self. In the second half of the journey, we are made humble and we stand in awe of the mystery. We step out of the shackles of shame and doubt and form a liaison with a much greater force than ourselves. So in my journey, this change was quite radical. I sort of dropped a lot of my identity around postures, the importance of postures. Not that I don't do them and teach them now, but it was something else that it was starting to pull me or lure me. And And this was, I think, working what I like to call the subtle body, certainly working with my emotions, my fears, my anxieties, my shame. And this is, I think, the path of the wounded warrior. Like, we don't come to be the warrior unless we work through our wounds. Unbeknownst to ourselves, we each lug around a heavy backpack stuffed with longing for acceptance and a fear of rejection. At the beginning of the trail, and from a vantage point that is extremely limited, we equip ourselves with ideas and beliefs about the journey. In the beginning, we make elaborate assumptions about the way we should be. The soul is yet to pass through the gates of fire, loneliness, and deep silence that build maturity and wisdom. We have yet to experience loss and suffering and to witness directly the beauty and fallibility of our own small, fragile selves. When we first come to the mat, our beliefs may have been molded by an overarching religious structure that is wont to divide the world into two: right and wrong, good and bad, male and female, pure and sullied, true and false, heaven and hell. Armed with fixed convictions, we unwittingly block the flow of the soul self, which is fluid, shadowy, polymorphous, and full of a raw and wild energy. The enduring spirit of the soul self is non-conforming. At the beginning of a yoga path, we may simply wish to become sleeker, sexier, more efficient, or more powerful. We may have a burning desire to get away from where we are. Progress on the path typically becomes a kind of self-improvement project. We may use the practice as a means to escape either the pressures of work or personal history or the drone of our own thoughts. Because we are driven by self-interest, the path is inevitably narrow and we can only see a few yards ahead. That was certainly the case for me in the beginning. Looking back, probably the case it is for me now. My view is still very, very narrow, aperture, like super small, but back then it was just the size of a grain of sand. And so the whole journey, I feel, is this opening up the aperture. And how can we open up that big mind? How can we open up to big view, panoramic view? So the first chapter of my book is called Empty Before You Begin. It's called Empty Before You Begin. Empty Before You Begin is a most difficult practice. Typically, the inbox of our mind is jammed with messages, private messages from family and loved ones, work-related messages that add to your task list, advertisements that goad you to acquire something you really don't need. It's only by emptying can we become fully attentive and present. Empty Before You Begin is essentially a call to presence in a meditation. Here at the start of this book, I implore you, O reader, to empty before you begin. That is, to make yourself open and clear for each word on the page. So we talk a lot about the importance of emptying out, of kind of clearing the clutter every morning when we get up, to take your pee, go right to your cushion, and sort of clear the cobwebs. Not an easy thing to do, to work through that clutter, all kinds of clutter, all kinds of storage, memorabilia, old photographs, pictures of old loved ones, and baseball cards, and old dresses, and your favorite dolls, all stacked in boxes in your storage. So we work through these layers and layers of personal history, which I sometimes think of as an archaeological dig, really sort of digging through these layers. When we get to the cushion and sit with a lifted spine, we must ask, out of all that I've accumulated, what really belongs? We identify with our mind memorabilia, but is it really me? When we look long and hard over many sessions, we begin to realize that all the stuff we have compiled in our minds and hearts over the years is surplus. We come to realize that what we really need to do is pare down, discard, and let go. How do we let go in the midst of lives that are full to the brim? Like your life now, I imagine, in quarantine, is family, zooming around and taking care of your finances, your cash flow, your kids. How do we manage in our lives that are full to the brim? How do we learn not to hoard not only material possessions, but feelings, viewpoints, and ideals? This is where practice comes in. We learn bit by bit, breath by breath, to let go of who we think we are and who we think we have to be. Yoga is as much a process of unlearning as it is a path of learning. In the first few years, our practice is like a raft, one that ferries us across the divide of the self. It provides security and certitude and helps us travel. However, at some point, we must be willing to dismantle the very same raft that has carried us along. We give up the raft, but keep the wisdom entrusted to us on the journey. The process of unpacking and letting go begins in the body and involves a passage from outer to inner. For instance, at the beginning of yoga, we do postures that stretch and loosen connective tissue, fascia, which is the outer covering of the body. This flexible layer of tissue just under the skin is responsible for determining our characteristic identity structure. Our exterior may be taut and constricted, or maybe lax and weak. In the first years of practice, we engage the outer musculature, such as the deltoids, the traps, the glutes, the hamstrings, etc. In time, and this takes years, we open and activate the core musculature, the intrinsic muscles along the spine. Hatha yoga is essentially a pilgrimage to the inner sanctum of the spine. So really, of course, in this book, I bring in lots of ways to work with meditation, to clear the cobwebs, to dust your corners, so that we can be more open, more available, more present, more loving, more kind in the flow of all that we do. Breathing lies right at the heart of letting go. Each breath we take and each breath we let out is a practice in letting go. The breath itself becomes the guide, the guru, teaching us to empty and release. Also, we must learn to let go of thoughts, sensations, expectations, and judgments. With practice, every moment that arises is an opportunity to let go. The art of mindfulness is remembering again and again to let go. We often imagine letting go to be a passive thing, akin to releasing our clasp on a balloon string. However, there is effort involved. Sometimes effort involves non-efforting, sometimes simply called non-efforting effort. Right effort, as it's called in the Buddhist teachings, is cultivated in all of the martial arts, essentially. Qigong, Tai Chi, yoga. Right effort is the gateway to the subtle body. So I have a whole chapter on right effort, not easy for me, being a sort of high octane type, always looking to make progress, to really find this way of letting go and not efforting as much. And so in the chapter on right effort, I talk a little bit about my own first half of the journey. I was drawn to a high octane power practice, supercharged. I was fervent about making progress and was on a trajectory of upward mobility through the order of poses. It was the kind of practice where students look like they're getting into gym class, donning sweatbands, carrying towels, and wearing skimpy clothes. I was fervent, disciplined, and competitive. Inwardly, I competed against myself, eager to better myself. Outwardly, I would compare myself to other students on the mat. The practice was a rite of passage, testing myself through strenuous and acrobatic poses. I was eager to prove myself and receive validation from the guru and the fellow students alike. The more strength and flexibility I mustered, the more I thought I advanced through the system. I grew attached to the system, felt loyal to its methodology, and ardently defended the techniques and protocol we used in practice. I felt that I had found my tribe, inspired by the mantra, the specialized breath work, and the flow of poses. I took on the identity of the tribe. I wore Indian clothing, became a strict vegetarian, and learned Sanskrit. In these beginning years, multiple hidden forces were at work within me. Had I been striving since grade school, since second grade in the same way? What ghost within my personal history was I exorcising? I felt compelled to pass through a ring of fire and burn my old identity in favor of a new, more spiritually appealing one. All the while, I was operating from the willful urge of my own striver. So I wanted just to share, let's see, a couple of images from that time. You might be interested just to learn and see that my practice, now this obviously is the cover of the book, published by Shambhala here last week, Shambhala Publication. And so I was in South India in the late 80s, working with a teacher named Patabi Joyce, who was quite fierce, actually. He was about 85, 86 in this photo. He was like a tiger. I mean, he looks like he's 50 in that photo. He's very strong, very, very fierce in his presence, but they're plowing myself in. I survived, just barely, but the rigor of the practice was quite extreme. Now, there was only about 8 of us in the room. This is before power yoga. This was even before power yoga or vinyasa yoga started in the United States, the early days, and so he would literally kneel on us, and we'd go back in these positions, and cultivating this kind of wild tapas. Tapas is asceticism, really opening up tissues very quickly. And I had a very good friend at that time named John Scott, a Kiwi I lived with, a New Zealander, and look at me, I was like, my shorts, I'm on the left there, my shorts are practically down at my ankles, and so I was like really just like wringing myself out, and totally exhausted day after day, but thought that of course I was making progress on the path. You can see Ganesha behind me there, so I sort of grapple with what is India, and you have these gods and these chants and these offerings, these temples, like what is that, and prayers and mantras, like oh my god, it's like mind bending, like what is all of this? And I just kind of fell in. I had really no idea. Not that I have much of an idea now where I'm going, but it certainly back then didn't really know where I was going. But I did the physical practice to really work in the extreme posture work that was it was very, very intense, very rigorous, and I had the self-discipline to stay with it, and I had an Iyengar background, so I basically knew somewhat how to protect my joints, because the Iyengar work is much more careful. This work was pretty fast and furious, but it was great. I was in my early 20s. I revved it up. It's been a long time since I did this kind of, extreme joint mobility. But as I mentioned in the book, it was important for me at the time to have that kind of prowess or achievement. Here's my wife, Surya. Here we are playing around years later. And many of you know her, of course. She's really the guru. I'm just the peon. She's wonderful. And then we go on and we teach courses and trainings and share some of the little beads of wisdom I've been able to harvest over the years, whatever little droplets I can muster. And this is our space here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And of course, I'm a father. I have a 16-year-old boy. The hardest yoga, of course, is trying to reel in my 16-year-old off of Fortnite. That's the hardest task of all. And then we have a great pooch, of course, who is really the guru, Shri Haro, our pup. And then this is taken in White Sands, New Mexico. Spent lots of time in the desert, roaming around here in New Mexico. Very powerful, of course, to commune in the desert. I take a lot of solace from the canyons, and have been drawn to the American West, in my hitchhiking days way back when I took off from New England and cruised around the country. I just was exploring the West, and so I've always been partial to the mountains and very much in favor of conserving the nature. May the EPA save what little wildlands we have. Terrible for the gas oil industry and the rape and pillage and plunder of the land. So very much in favor of yoga on the land, of the land, for the land. And so anyhow, when we moved to Santa Fe in 1989, 90, actually, well, I'll share that story in just a moment about the Presbyterian Church. Let's see, I'm pretty close to that here. In the second half of my practice, I've spent precious time reflecting on the origins of my inner striver. My father was an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, as was his grandfather, as was his grandfather. So I'm sort of like the fourth generation. All these, Presbyterian jefes, these ministers come before me. It's, it's Scottish descent, quite a load, little, of course, my last name, connecting the Scottish roots. And so even though I was not actively raised in the church community, the Protestant ethic circulated through my bloodstream. When I first began yoga, invisible forces urged me on, motivating me into handstands and backbends. I was under the spell of familial and cultural assumptions as I strived towards gain and sought approval. These were forces that had been set in motion long ago, from the time of the Pilgrims, really. Persuasive forces much bigger and more impactful than my short lifetime. So I think that a lot of my own personal practice, and I encourage my students to do the same, to reflect on our own personal history. There's many of us who get caught up in Indian philosophy and mantras and, Shiva and all this. And then I think there's a time in which we turn back to our own self. That is, we look back into our own personal history. We come back to our, investigating our own upbringing. I've met many students come through my training work who are, born and raised Mormon backgrounds, Baptist backgrounds, or grown up on hippie communes, or, so wherever we come from, it very much informs who we are. And then I think a lot of us aren't aware of how we map those onto, the Eastern spirituality. So I think this return to my own upbringing, in this case, the Presbyterian stuff is quite important. Now, when I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, I lived at Ghost Ranch, an hour north of Santa Fe in the little town of Abiquiu, where Ghost Ranch, where George O'Keeffe would paint her white pelvises against the blue sky. And it's currently owned by the Presbyterian Church. And so beautiful place. You have to go visit there if you get a chance when you come to New Mexico. And so really my first tenure here in New Mexico was on that ranch and spending time in the canyons and going on walkabout under the stars. So I talk a little bit about the importance of the middle way path when it comes to working with striver. The middle way path was espoused, of course, by the teachings of the Buddha. He was really cautious against severe asceticism. The Buddha almost starved himself at one point. Siddhartha, in his own tapas, in his own, disciplined efforts to awaken, and nearly passed out. So he was cautious against extreme asceticism, what I think of as too severe. And so I write in here on, one of my teachers described right effort as a combination of tension and laxity, or tight-loose. This suggests both readiness and relaxation. When we discover the very fine balance between effort and ease, resistance and receptivity, control and surrender, knowing and not knowing, we embody the middle path. This exquisite balance lies right at the heart of yoga practice. Before arriving in the middle, I spent many years experimenting with extremes. Not only did I do extreme poses and survive, but I was extreme in my diet and in my ideals and judgments. At times I would project my narrative of idealism outward onto others. Yet more often than not, my extremism was inwardly directed. Eager to make progress on the path, spiritual aspirants, or what Robert Bly called spiritual ascenders, are often inwardly demanding. If not careful, inward pressure can give way to self-punishing thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors. Living under the weight of internal expectations, real or imagined, we are prone to harm ourselves. Thus, the Buddha's directive to live the middle way was meant to steer practitioners away from severe attitudes of self-condemnation, self-denial, and self-abuse. So I have one chapter in the book. It's on not knowing, maybe really important today, given the time we're in now with election coming up and schools maybe not opening and loved ones far away in other states and far off countries. There's so much not knowing that we experience, and not knowing, of course, has been a real important practice in the meditative tradition, especially in the Buddhist teachings and the Zen teachings for many years. And so really when we're working with not knowing, we're working with the way that we tend to see the world as black and white, and we start to really not being open to expansiveness of not knowing, being open to what possibility might happen, but we become really rigid with a kind of polarity. And so I write in this chapter on not knowing, at one time we all experienced spacious awareness, like the spaciousness of a child, a state free from the polarizing limits of self versus other, inner versus outer, right versus wrong, and good versus bad. Inevitably, when socialized, we break down the vast and immeasurable universe into small prefab boxes. This task, in large part, falls to our parents. As a parent myself, I found the responsibility of conditioning my child's reality daunting, guiding him from a state of unconditioned awareness to the importance of not throwing the butter knife at the dog or crawling around on the floor of Whole Foods in the frozen food aisle. As a child, I was raised in part with lessons from the celebrated stars of Sesame Street: Big Bird, Grover, Ernie, and Bert. I distinctly remember as a budding 5-year-old sitting in the big leather chair in our family living room den, watching multiple episodes of this show. I witnessed bananas and oranges bouncing across the screen in time to the little ditty. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things is just not the same. Gazing wide-eyed at the screen, my unbounded mind was being indoctrinated, however melodiously and delightfully, into the ways of oppositional thinking. So I go into how meditation, of course, works with our opposition mind or our dualistic mind or our split mind, and how we can rest in not knowing, how we can be open. Having carried the staff of certainty for years and adhering closely to the formulas of practice, I eventually found a way to redefine my identity. Transitioning from a place of certainty and conviction to a place of not knowing is an arduous and daunting task. At some point, the spiritual path requires a leap into the unknown, outside the framework of the familiar. Moving into uncharted territory demands that we trust, have courage, and be willing to take a leap of faith. I'm reminded of an old Chinese proverb: to say you don't know is the beginning of knowing. For me, not knowing has opened up unforeseen vistas along the path. We never really know the outcome of what we do. For instance, not knowing is fundamental to the process of writing. As I compose this sentence or read my book before you, I follow the thread of not knowing. When you plant a garden, get married, or look up at the stars, you participate in the inscrutable ways of not knowing. Not knowing is the fuel, the raw energy that enables us to move and shake. The craft of teaching must include not knowing. I think the best teachers are those who have studied their material and can walk into a classroom in the spirit of not knowing, open to the way the class will unfold. Within any discipline, one must combine a learned familiarity with a willingness to embrace the unforeseen. Like a high wire act, skillful action requires a tricky balance of knowing and not knowing, holding on and letting go, control and surrender. So that's the chapter on not knowing. Then let's see, I have, wrapping up here with just a few more passages, I have a chapter on what I call in the flow of presence. So much of this path is about being in the flow of presence right where you are now, just listening, sitting in your chair, evening light coming in, your breath, your cup of tea, just being with the moment you're in now. In the path of practice, if the path of practice is to be in the now, how do we realize it? How could we grasp that which has no fixed shape and follows no definite rules? How do we live a life of presence in tune with our surroundings? Players of all disciplines crave immersion in the moment. Saxophonists, figure skaters, the center fielder for the Boston Red Sox, Zen calligraphers and Tai Chi masters, all alike relish the opportunity to become absorbed in their craft. Yogis look for the experience of absorption all the time. They are not content to experience isolated and short-lived states of absorption. If the process of absorption is limited to the 90 minutes we spend on our 3x8 sticky mat each day, then the process of yoking is only partial. The aim of practice is ongoing, total 24/7 immersion. So I go on, and the last chapter of the book is called Why Shavasana is the Most Important Pose. Many of you know that I like to begin my practice in Shavasana. Usually yoga classes think, oh, wait till Shavasana at the end. Why wait to the end to do Shavasana? Why not do it in the beginning? So in Shavasana, it's ironic, of course, because Shavasana is where we're most revitalized. People think Shavasana is the corpse pose. Like, oh, it's like being dead. No, don't misconstrue. Shav in Sanskrit, here's my scholarly side. Shav means to alter, to transform. The root shav. So Shavasana is the pose of transformation. It's the pose in which we are able to find a passage, a pathway through the veil to the other side. So Shavasana, sometimes we insert Shavasana between each pose. You could do 2 or 3 poses and do Shavasana. So do Shavasana when you get up, do Shavasana before dinner, do Shavasana before bedtime, do Shavasana in your boardroom meeting. Nobody will see you when you're lying down there for a break on your Zoom. So Shav is the pose in which we shapeshift and we transform. A few years ago, some of you know my father died. It was quite, of course, significant to be a son and experience. I was with him when he took his last breath. And, you know, my father was a looming figure for me, physically, psychologically, emotionally, and just, you know, working my way through his death, of course, is, you know, good 10-year, 20-year project or a few lifetimes. And so I'm still doing that. And so I was with him when he took his last breath. And I think some of you, of course, work in hospice, or, you know, you're social workers, or, you know, you're caretakers. And so maybe you've experienced what it's like to actually experience death at the end. So the very last passage of my book is called Reflections on Death. In the Parinirvana Sutra of the Buddhist teachings, composed around the 2nd century, it is said of all meditations that on death is supreme. At the end of the path, we pause and consider, what is it like to die? Hopefully, at the culmination of life, we still have our wits about us, but that is a big if. Many die in a stupor, either throttled by dementia, in a blue haze of morphine, or in a swoon of confusion. If at all possible, we are mindful to the end, but death is as unpredictable as life. We don't know if death will come in the day or the night, as a slow fade or a flash. The body has no built-in expiration date. Generally, life is like a locomotive that churns and spews and pushes across mountains and valleys and open plains. We never imagine it coming to a halt until it does. Perhaps you have had the opportunity, like I did, bedside, to be with someone as they enter into the tunnel of death. It is a gift to witness the flame of life flickering and fading. All petty concerns, all gripes and grudges drop away. Death is the great equalizer. It is both raw and beautiful to witness. Death moves in its own time capsule. Moments hang suspended like stars in far-off galaxies. There's nothing to do about death. You may offer encouragement saying, it's all right, you can let go, I'm here for you. But the letting go must begin much earlier. The lessons of letting go cannot be realized in the fleeting moments as the breath leaves the body. This is why Shavasana is so important. Shavasana is the dress rehearsal for death, so that if possible, we remember in ourselves, in our diaphragm, in our heart and mind, just how to let go. The process of dying is a plunge into mystery, where being with not knowing is the most we can do. It is an irony that we spend most of our day making sense, figuring things out. In the practice of Shavasana and on death's doormat, there is no further calculation. In the throes of dying, reason loses traction. You have to just be with what is. At death's door, there's a kind of cocooning. It is as if the dying are inside a chrysalis, incubating. Unable to see, taste, or touch, the pupa's innards are soft, raw, and vulnerable. In this way, death is like birth. There's a period of gestation where the animating spirit tucks into itself, preparing to shapeshift and move on. Shavasana, too, involves a process of cocooning. In Shavasana, we are swaddled, folded inward so that we may rest deeply. We may use blankets, eye pillows, sandbags, or the like to coax the life force to retreat far inside. In Shavasana, the prana submerges and returns home, back to the source from which it came. At the end of life, a force kicks in that is beyond reckoning. It's as old as the coelacanth, as astounding as the tiger, and as immeasurable as the stars. At the very end, there is nothing but breath and the strange alchemy of prana. It moves of its own accord, propelled by the great regulator far down the brainstem. We visualize the final transition. It is a passage, like entry through the birth canal or a slow descent down a spiral staircase. It is like the custom of Native American tribes of the Northwest who transport their dead by placing the body in a canoe and floating it downriver to catch the ebbing tide out to sea. So thank you all for listening. It's been a joy for me to share with you little musings, excerpts from my book, Practices the Path. Many kind thanks to all my supporters, my wife, my publisher, Beth Frankel, my staff, Holly, Christina, my dog, my sticky mat, all of my relations. Thanks for supporting me in this journey. Christina?
All right, so thank you, Tia. That was wonderful, and deep congratulations to you on your new book. We've got some questions coming through in the chat box, and let's see. We've got Angie, looks like she's from the UK. She says, it sounds like your path has gone from rigor to openness. What are you currently curious about in your practice, and how is it unfolding now?
Yeah, good. That's good. It's gone from rigor to openness. What am I most interested in now? Well, there's that expression in Sanskrit, Satchitananda. Satchitananda is just really the delight of being. And while this is a difficult time for all of us with the quarantine asana and the uncertainty, I still just try to really steep like tea leaves into my own joy of being. And it's always readily available. Sometimes I'm so distracted and worried and caught up that I can't rest in it. But I try to rest in that delight and then share little fragments of that delight with my family and friends and students.
Great, lovely. We have from Melissa, could you tell us about your mother's yoga practice and how that influenced you?
Well, my mother started yoga in 1978 when we lived in London for a year. And so, yes, she studied Iyengar yoga. And, so she's always been such a mentor of mine. I'm very much aligned and attuned to my mother. And so, yeah, she was my first inspiration on the path. And she's 86 and still does shoulder stand.
Very impressive. Okay, so we also have from Angie. She says this is a very personal philosophical book. What was the motivation for writing it?
My first book was full of anatomy and Sanskrit terminology. And I thought, well, okay, my practice is much closer to heart now. It's not as abstract. It's not as sort of philosophical. And so the book's meant to be, I don't know if it's exactly a page turner, whether you're going to read it on the beach, but it's meant to, to flow. It's a pretty easy read. And so, but yeah, at one point I was a little bit more in hiding, kind of keeping my own personal journey more protective and private. But, I don't have quite the same concerns now because I just don't have as much attachments to my own identity and self. So I'm much more willing, it's taken me a good 20 years to be able to be more willing to share. But yeah, I'm happy to share, the trials and the struggles and the pain that I've gone through.
Great, thank you too. We have from Annie, this one looks like it might be quite deep. We've got a question from her saying, T.S., I remember you saying once upon a time that a yogi is ambidextrous, bipartisan, and bisexual. I loved that notion, but now I question the bipartisan piece in today's climate, where one political party has done so much harm. Any current thoughts about that?
Right. That's right. I did say that. You're quoting accurately. Ambidextrous, bipartisan, and bisexual. I mean, the idea is like, like those oranges and bananas bouncing across the stream in Sesame Street. We tend to think of the world in such a divided way. When we come into the space of the heart and we're in service of all beings, the creepy crawlies, the trees, the rivers, the bird people, the whales, we're in service of that good work. And so however we can be in service of the whole, the entire. And so, right, there's all kinds of schisms at large now, and we need to roll up our sleeves and work on the level of the dichotomies. We need to work within the splits towards wholeness. We can't expect wholeness to drop out of the sky. So that way, yes, definitely vote Democratic this fall. But, no bias here, but, can we, in a good way, support women's rights? Can we support, people of color? So really, can we be as open-minded as we can be? And I just know what it's like to be kind of narrow myself with my aperture quite narrow, and maybe your own religious or cultural upbringing is the same. So, can we really be compassionate? And so we might have to work in the world of duality as we work towards that, what Thich Nhat Hanh called the interbeing of all.
Great. And next we have from Peter Miko. You have talked about energy and courage in the roots of Prajna Yoga. How do you draw on these two elements to achieve your goals?
Right, so we definitely need energy, so it's, especially at this time, a lot of people are not sleeping well, and there's lots of uncertainty and fear, and that really is corrosive to the subtle body and to our well-being. So we need energy, we need vitality, and that virya, that also leads to courage. We need courage at this time. Wake up in the morning and say, okay, I can be in a world of conflict. I can be in a world of divisiveness. I can have the courage to, to get on the street and march, or to stand up for what I believe in, and to support each other. So yeah, energy and courage. Thank you, Peter, for bringing that in. Really important at this time.
Okay, and next up we have a question from Sarah Steen. Can Tia speak about faith on the path?
Very hard to come to faith these days because things are so topsy-turvy, Sarah. Good question. The world is topsy-turvy, and there's a lot of malevolence, there's a lot of maliciousness around, and there's a lot of untruths, and you read in the news, and it's just, how do we come into a place of trust? And so really, I think it's irrational. It's irrational. Real trust is irrational. You have to kind of suspend rationality. I do it in my meditation, and then you just be with the embodiment of trust. Now that shows up as openness in your throat chakra, or softening in your belly, softening in your heart. Begins at home, it begins inside here. So yeah, really, I think faith is irrational. You can't suss it out. It doesn't lend itself to objectification. So that's okay. Steep your tea leaves in that trust, in your own private moments, in your own little corner of your home, and build your strength there. Build your trust.
Great. Next up, we have a question from Marilyn Preston. You mentioned the second half of your practice, the second half of your journey. Can the second half begin so early that there is no first half, just the good stuff?
Right. Well, that second half, it might go into a whole third half. Who knows? I don't know. I'm in the not knowing here myself. But yeah, I think that the first half, I was just so kind of myopic with the postures, and it's, the yoga industry is kind of like that today. It's all yoga postures. I mean, postures are just postures, right? I don't take stock in whether I can do poses anymore. It's not that important to me, but one time I had a lot invested in that. So the second half is like, wow, like what's in my heart? What's my own, my hopes and fears? And so, yeah, but I think there can be a third half looming.
Great. We've got another question from Sarah. If we are all headed toward death on our path, how do we find meaning in life in light of ultimate destination?
Right, so some of you know that Ayurveda is the science of life. Ayur means life, Veda means knowledge, that practice of herbs and medicine. Now, if Ayurveda is the science of life, then yoga is the science of death. It's like we learn to let go. We learn to let go of our hope, our pettiness, all of our little fixations. And that allows us to experience, I think, maybe I've just touched on this a bit here and there, a sense of spaciousness and wonderment. And so, you know, the Tibetans really hone in on this now, that really that last half hour, the transition, the bardo between life and death, it's like, what's the state of consciousness there? I think when we are open system, we're less grasping, that we experience this, the kind of spaciousness that the death allows, of course, when we really do what's called Maha Samadhi, when we really dissolve. So, you know, dissolve yourself a little bit each day. And then I don't know, it's a strange alchemical thing that we become more available, we become more receptive, we become more alive. So a little bit each day, practice what's called Laya Yoga, the yoga of dissolution.
Great. I think we have some time for a couple more. We have another question from Angie, quite interesting. If you hadn't discovered yoga, where do you think your path would have led?
If I would have taught high school, I thought I was going to teach high school English. Kind of like to do that. I should be good. I can just retire my yoga shorts and get into the classroom and teach To Kill a Mockingbird and just open, you know, sophomores' imagination. I love that. Not long ago, I went to our local Catholic middle school here in Santa Fe. You know, it's very heavily Catholic in Santa Fe. And I was brought in as the yoga guy in this, you know, this world religions class. They were studying Hinduism. I was a yoga guy, right? So I got up there and did some fancy handstand. These are like, you know, 7th graders. I got up there, some fancy handstand, you know, showed some stuff, like hot stuff. And then I got their attention, right? And then I asked them, you know, this is the first question I asked them. I said, okay, you know, please raise your hand. Who here in this room never talks to yourself? Like doesn't have any kind of internal talking going on? I said, you know, so let me see a show of hands. You know, these like 14-year-olds, nobody raised their hand. It's like, that's the beginning of yoga. Then we start, you know, noting that we're talking to ourselves. And it's a long process of sorting through that inner voice. So anyhow, I'd probably teach high school English and teach a little meditation on the side.
Very nice. We have a short question from Tanya asking if you could talk about your writing process.
My writing process. Yeah, it's a lot of not knowing. I mean, it's arduous when you open up that open page and it's like, oh my God, where am I going? And I'll tell you something. As soon as the book came out, you know, it was astounding. Like day one, I was like, it was just last week. I was like, oh no, I wanted to change this whole piece. It's like, oh no, I really want to rewrite this passage. You know, because there's a chapter in here on what I call the demon of perfectionism. I have it pretty strong in me, and I think it's that Puritan Presbyterian thing. And it's like right away, I wanted to redo it. And so that's it. You know, you got to get the open page in the writing process or in the teaching process, like I'm doing now. You sit in front of the screen and you just roll the dice. You just open it out, and then you let it go at the end. And as a teacher, as a writer, I have to learn how to do that, you know, to create and let go. Because if you hold on, how can I write another book? I have another book brewing. I'm open to suggestions, the receiver line is open if you have suggestions, but I think it'll be on the fluid body maybe. And so, you know, how can I go forward? How can I write again if I get stuck on one page?
Great. Okay, I think we've got time for these last two here. Do you have any specific recommendations for counteracting the proliferating flattening of Zoom and other necessary two-dimensional interactions as we shelter?
Very good question. Wouldn't it be nice if Zoom were three-dimensional? You could sort of get into a portal. Maybe it'll be virtual reality, you know, our next big quarantine will be virtual reality. And you could I could take you right into the spleen or into the thoracic 7th vertebra, and we could just kind of tube right in there. And then we get some Sanskrit quotes and some cool, you know, references to Ayurveda, and it would just be like multi-dimensional. I agree. it's very one-dimensional. So meditate more, because in meditation, there are no dimensions. Dimension-free, you know. Buddhists call it shunyata, spaciousness, boundlessness. So I do, you know, before I get on Zoom, I try to rest in the multi-dimensional or the, you know, the non-dimensional, and then be in that one-dimensional for a bit, and then I have to kind of do some repair work, because it's pretty flat screen, this stuff.
Great. And the last question here we've got from Teague. Can you talk about the role of sharing or not sharing personal stories and experiences in yoga teaching?
I think it's important, if you can do it, you know, skillfully, to weave in your own experience. It's, you know, sometimes people get a little carried away. They take the floor and it's like me, and it's like, you know, they get in sort of the tunnel of I. So, you know, I've sort of gotten out my pickaxe and chipped away at this I thing here, this construct of I. So, you know, last thing I can do is just sort of get stuck on me while I'm sharing with you. But that could happen, unless people have done their homework. But otherwise, I think it's really great. It's like, just be real, just be frank, just be genuine. And I didn't, in the beginning, I hid behind the mantra. I hid behind, you know, my teachers. I was like, I was trying to emulate my teachers. And, you know, I sort of, you know, just cut and paste. I just did what they did. I didn't have my own, you know, I didn't know my own voice yet. So that was a good 25-year project to come into my voice. And so, yeah, I think sharing from the heart, especially at this time, it's, you know, make it real. Don't put on some kind of, you know, transcendental, supercalifragilistic, you know, Himalayan, you know, thing. Just make it real.
Great. We've got a great suggestion from Peter Miko to make a hologram of you, which I think is a great idea. We should work on that. Before we close, actually, a great question came through from Lauren Morgenstein. Before getting in touch with your inner voice as you got older, did you spend a lot of time grappling between what your mind says and what your inner voice and heart says? Do you find yourself mostly listening to your inner voice now? Is it a practice for you to listen to your inner voice? Does it get easier to cultivate?
Well, very good question. I've had to work through many, many voices. You know, I've had a lot of corrosive voices, you know, hand-me-down voices I've had to work with over the years of, you know, you're not good enough and you got to be better, and, you know, either competition or shame, and so, or just self-improvement, like, oh, I'm not good enough, I just need to be better, make myself better. And so I've had to really kind of listen to those voices as they drop into my inbox, and then develop a pretty good spam filter. So now, you know, I don't let in those voices as much. I got pretty skillful, you know, because when those deleterious voices drop in, they can really derail me. So, you know, so I would suggest for all of you, develop a good spam filter. I mean, there'll be some really good voices come in. I had some really great mentors, my dream therapist, my soccer coach, and my mom, you know, my good buddies, Nikolai, Henry. So, you know, then I really let in certain voices, but we have to be careful, because it can also be corrosive. So, so yeah, the meditation is invaluable for that, developing good spam filter.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. As you can see, Surya has joined us as well. Thank you for coming in, Surya. And again, deep congratulations to TS. I've got my copy right here. So yes, I've posted within the chat box, and I'll do it again, all the links to purchase, should you wish to. And yeah, so thank you everyone for being here. This is a very exciting time for us. And deep congratulations to TS.
I was hoping to hear that.
Do I need to say something, Christina?
Tell her you.
I think we're good. Yeah, no, everyone's just chatting in, saying congratulations.
Well, thank you.
All good.
It's good. Well, maybe if I just take one. I'm having a hard time hearing, so I was hoping to hear. Can you hear me? She could hear me? Yeah, good. Oh, okay. Do you hear them? No. Let me have that one. Oh, well, it's hard to hear you, but really great to be here.
We're doing the rifle right now.
Congratulations.